Kia ora tātou, and welcome to this Lawyers for Climate Action NZ webinar. My name's Deborah Dorrington, and I will be chairing this session today. The topic today is New Zealand's Climate Change Clause Bank. But before we get underway, I do just want to tell you about a couple of kind of admin things. The first is just to confirm the format. We've allowed 45 minutes for this presentation. The first 30 minutes of it will be our speaker giving the presentation, and then we've allowed additional time for questions. So rather than questions kind of interrupting the flow of the presentation, please do use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen there, and put your questions in there. I'm not sure that they'll pop up that you can see them, but I'll be able to see them, and we'll monitor those and deal with those questions at the end. We're fortunate today to have someone speaking to us who's really at the forefront of creating and using a practical tool for climate conscious practice for lawyers. And I'd like to introduce you to Ian MacKenzie. Ian sits on the NZLS Climate Change Law Committee, but it's not in that role that he's here. He's a practicing lawyer and he's head of legal at New Zealand Green Investment Finance. It's a green investment bank that was established for the purpose of encouraging investment focused on New Zealand and a low carbon future. In that role, and building on the work that's already been undertaken by the Chancery Lane project, Ian initiated the creation of a bank of clauses for use in New Zealand in the negotiation and the drafting of a full range of contracts. And these clauses address issues relating to climate change. A number of law firms participated in this project as well. I guess it's true to say that many of us want to take climate action, but we struggle sometimes, say, to understand exactly how we're going to do that in our daily work. But through Ian's initiative, we now have a tool to start with that. So thank you, Ian. Ian's going to introduce the clauses and then give us some guidance as to how they can be used to improve the sustainability characteristics of the contracts that we're drafting day by day. And hopefully, along the way, we'll hear a bit about the New Zealand Green Investment Finance organisation too, and his role there as a climate conscious lawyer. Thank you for speaking to us, Ian, and I'm going to mute myself and hand over to you.
Kia ora, Deborah. Ngā mihi nō kia koutou. It's great to be here talking about climate contracting with you all. I will attempt to share my screen so that you don't spend the next 30 minutes looking at me. You can look at a presentation instead. Hopefully that is working. Perhaps, Deborah, you could just let me know if it has or not.
It's fine. It's fine, Ian.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, as Deborah said, I am still Ian MacKenzie. I'm the head of legal at New Zealand Green Investment Finance, or NZGIF, as we refer to ourselves. So Deborah's gone through all the key sort of housekeeping in terms of what this presentation is going to cover and how it's going to run. So we will get straight into it. So I'll assume that this audience will have at least some passing awareness of who NZGIF is as an organisation, but I know that my comms team would be mortified if I passed up the opportunity to speak to a captive audience about who we are and what we do. So we'll start off with a little bit of an introduction about us. So we're a Crown-owned green investment bank. We're set up to accelerate investment in decarbonisation in Aotearoa. Green investment banks have been used around the world to kickstart investment in decarbonisation initiatives. So you'll all no doubt be aware of the scale of the financing gap that exists for green finance. It's literally trillions of dollars every year that need to be invested in order to meet the climate change mitigation goals. So it is a really huge challenge, and green investment banks around the world have played an important part in meeting that challenge. So our mission is focused on us here in our little corner of the world, and we do that by being a long-term purpose-driven investor with a very flexible mandate. So that means we can invest across capital stack. So we can provide senior debt, we can provide equity, we can provide anything in between. We have a very long investment horizon. So many of the loans that we've made to date have been for 10 years or more. So and as I've said, we exist to essentially fill the investment vacuum in climate finance that the private sector is not quite funding at the moment, but hopefully will in the not too distant future, and certainly will need to if we're going to meet our climate change goals. And the fact that we're sort of blazing a trail is reflected in the nature of our investments and what we do. So much of what we do is novel and market leading. So, for example, over the last 4 years, we've played a really important role in scaling of domestic solar and EV deployment. And you can see our target sectors there on the screen. That gives some examples of the sorts of investments that we look for. So we're reasonably young in comparison to some of our international green bank peers, but our rate of commitment has been one of the fastest in that green bank sector. We're also part of a global green bank network, and one of our core objectives is market demonstration or show market leadership. And it's that market demonstration objective that has brought me here today to talk to you all. So why are we here? Put simply, because the world's in a state of collapse. This is obviously an audience of people who care about preventing climate change. So it is a case of preaching to the converted, which is always nice. But I do think it's helpful when having these sorts of discussions to come back to why we're actually doing this. And I think a good place to start is with the poster child for climate change, the polar bear that you can see on the screen there. So really, quite unfortunately, this is an animal that will very likely be extinct by the end of this century without drastic emissions cuts. And usually the climate crisis is spoken about by reference to how it's going to affect humans' way of life. And that's obviously a really valid perspective. It's our personal perspective on how we interpret what climate change is going to do to us. But I think it's also helpful to consider that we've had life on this planet for 10,000 times longer than modern humans have inhabited it. And it's only humans that have done anything to cause the sort of rapid climate change that we're experiencing at the moment. And it's really quite astonishing to me to think that we've had truly complex life for over 500 million years, but we've only had the capacity to change the climate for fewer than 200. So in other words, life got along fine with nature for literally 2.5 million times longer than we've been trying to destroy it. And we are now faced with the very real prospect that our actions will result in the extinction of thousands of species that have done nothing to cause climate change and can do nothing to prevent it, like the poor old polar bear here on the screen. So quite aside from what we do to each other, in prevaricating on this issue, it's a quite mind-bogglingly selfish attitude that we've adopted towards all the other creatures that inhabit this earth with us. And sort of drawing it back to humans and the actions we can take, we aren't great at taking responsibility for things that have gone wrong as a species. I'm sure you'll all know that in your personal and work lives. So we tend to want to lay the blame for the climate crisis and put the job of solving it somewhere else. So whether that's at the feet of government, who across the world haven't moved fast enough on the issue, or the big emitters who've profited from creating emissions during the fossil fuel age, we want to put the blame somewhere else. And while it is very important that those governments and big emitters certainly do step up, if we focus solely on them, that does conveniently miss the point that it's ultimately consumers who have the power to drive change. And that's something that personally I'm a very big believer in. So you'll all be aware of the fairly common argument against doing anything about climate change, particularly here, is that individuals, countries, whatever it might be, are too small to matter, and that anything we do is just a drop in the ocean, so effectively why bother? But of course it is ordinary citizens who, for the most part, elect governments. It's because of consumer demand that companies mine fossil fuels, produce single-use plastics, fly planes, sell cars, and do all of the other things that have contributed to the situation that we find ourselves in. From an investment perspective, it's because of shareholder expectations that companies have prioritised profit that's led to a preponderance of short-lived disposable products. And in the investment community specifically, even the largest investors in the world, like sovereign wealth funds and insurers, ultimately still do what they do just for the benefit of ordinary citizens. So actors in the economy respond to signals, and the signals come from an aggregation of individual actions. So now the purpose of the last few minutes of introduction hasn't been to get you to change your lifestyle. Of course you should do that, but that is a topic for another day and another forum. The purpose of this introduction really is to explain why an initiative like climate conscious drafting matters and why everyone should embrace it. Because ultimately the climate crisis is too big for one government, a handful of large emitters to solve. It will require everyone working together, making all the little changes that we can. So before we talk about climate aligned contracting, climate drafting, let's spend a little bit of time talking about Aotearoa's emissions profile, which is set out on the slide. Now, you'll be pleased to know, I guess, that nobody's actually measuring where legal drafting fits into this little pie chart yet. I guess it's a case of watch the space. But you all will be aware that this pie chart is fairly unique on a global scale. Our emissions profile here is different to other countries. Our grid is 85% renewable already. So that means that our emissions, as you all know, are primarily comprised of agricultural emissions by virtue of being a primary produce exporting country. So 50% of our emissions come from that sector. And this emissions profile does mean that we do need a much bigger section of the economy to be working towards decarbonisation. So unlike other countries, we can't get those big decarbonisation wins by greening our electricity grid. We've already done that. We did that really before we knew climate change was a problem. So that means that what we are looking for is a whole bunch of businesses in sectors like the primary sector that's comprised of a bunch of small disaggregated operators to take the action required to effect change. And so that's where an initiative like climate-aligned contracting can really help. By its very nature, it works best when applied to myriad different contracts. So it's the perfect solution for an economy like ours that needs to make lots of little wins on climate rather than a couple of big moonshots like other countries are aiming for. And climate drafting can have a real impact in driving change across the economy, which is what we're going to need if we are going to achieve our emissions reduction targets. And it's important to make no mistake that we will need to meet those targets. So in the last few days, for example, we've signed a fair trade agreement with the EU. And that fair trade agreement bakes in compliance with the Paris Agreement as a key cornerstone of it. So, for example, we have to cooperate in reducing the climate impact of food production under that agreement. So if that doesn't start to send alarm bells ringing in the primary sector, I'm not sure what will. Our trading partners are going to expect us to make progress on emissions, and there are going to be consequences if we don't. So that brings us to climate contracting. But what is that? What are we talking about? As you can see from the slide, this is concerned with how behaviour can be influenced by contract obligations to achieve better outcomes. So it's a subset of sustainable contracting, and anyone working in an organisation with a procurement function will know that sustainable contracting is becoming increasingly important. But why, now that we know what it is, why is it important and why should you be implementing it? So firstly, fundamentally, climate-aligned contracting is a way of walking the talk. So this audience will be well aware of the challenges associated with driving real climate action through sustainability promises and public pronouncements. So there's obviously the potential to get that wrong if you do it badly, but the fact is that most people don't do this stuff badly because they employ smart people like the lawyers, potentially on the call on this webinar, who make sure that what people say doesn't fall foul of the law. And consumers just simply don't have the time to understand the nuances of the various certifications and claims that businesses make with regard to sustainability. So I'm not saying that people shouldn't apply for those certifications and they shouldn't strive to meet the criteria for them. But I do suspect that the vast majority of the general public just don't understand what they actually mean. And all of that means that greenwashing has been able to take hold to distract from meaningful climate action, as you'll all be aware. So from making specific claims that are true, but that distract from broader emissions issues within a business, to green hushing, where you simply say nothing about emissions reduction objectives, to simply saying things that aren't true and hoping that a regulator will never test it. There are lots of reasons that the outcomes we need on climate just aren't being achieved by the way we are trying to go about it. But importantly, contract is different. So climate-aligned contracting is a way to show that you really are serious about climate change. Why is that? It's because it's not a flashy advertising campaign telling people how much you care. It's something that most people will never see. You don't get a sales bump from it, but it holds you to account. So with climate contracting, you are asking someone else to hold you to account for your actions, and you're doing that in private. So depending on the clause, you might be imposing an obligation on yourself for getting that obligation wrong. But as any in-house lawyers on this call will know, if something goes in a contract, it goes in an obligations register somewhere, and your compliance or audit function will want to know about it and will want to know that it's being complied with. So it is a way to drive behaviours and to drive change. So if you have a net zero commitment inside your organisation, you really do need to be using climate clauses to help drive that and show that you're serious about meeting your obligations under it. Now, another reason it's important to start implementing climate conscious contracting really as soon as you can is that contracts are really long-term obligations. So potentially 3, 5, 7 years, even longer. I've given you the example of our loan agreements, which are 10 years long, some of them. If you're entering into a contract now and you're not using climate clauses, what you're doing is missing a really important opportunity and locking in higher emissions under that contract for, as I've said, potentially a decade. And the third reason is speed. Contracts can be drafted and signed without having to wait for the government to give any sort of direction on climate change. It doesn't have to set any policy. If you're serious about climate action, the current ETS price doesn't have any bearing on what you say in your contract. You can shift the dial with contract much quicker than you can with other forms of intervention, particularly government action, which takes a long time, as everyone will know, to go through the policy process, and particularly in an election year, is subject to political whims. So that brings us to the New Zealand Climate Clause Bank itself, which you can see on the screen there. Very pretty document that we're all very proud of. So this is a unique global initiative designed to supercharge the uptake of climate-aligned drafting. It builds on the work of the Chancery Lane Project, which is an international collective of lawyers who contribute to climate contracting. So TCLP is based in the UK, and that is a jurisdiction much further along the climate mitigation curve than we are, particularly with regard to corporate net zero pledges, which, as I've mentioned, is where these clauses really are a must. So I absolutely love TCLP and the amazing work the team there does, but the market they've developed their clauses for is very different to little old Aotearoa. In a bigger market, it's a completely legitimate approach to have very ambitious clauses designed for the very biggest companies in the world, doing really sophisticated contracts for huge decarbonisation projects with complex cross-border arrangements and financing. But that just won't shift the dial here, because we simply don't have enough of those huge transactions to make a market. So as such, we need clauses that can be used by everyone, big and small. And in our cases, I've talked about, particularly given our emissions profile, small. So that's what we've sought to achieve. The New Zealand Climate Clause Bank is a suite of template clauses. Some of them are adapted from TCLP's work, some of them are new, and they've been negotiated with 11 law firms, including some of the top firms in the country. So these clauses are designed to represent a market standard approach to climate drafting, which allows them to be more easily adopted. Now, I'm a banking lawyer, so my approach to this has been very heavily influenced by the APLMA, the Asia Pacific Loan Markets Association. And everyone who works in or around transactional banking knows that the quickest way to get any loan agreement clause agreed is to say that it's APLMA. People take comfort from knowing that what they're agreeing to is what everyone else is agreeing to. So as the old saying goes, no one ever got fired for choosing IBM. Now, because there can be some organisational bureaucracy to work through in implementing any new drafting, especially with large organisations, the idea of market standard clauses that have been contributed to by the big firms is designed to help remove that red tape. So if you're an internal counsel and you're seeing a new clause going into your contract and you're wondering what it's all about, you can pick up the phone to your panel firm, and hopefully they were one of the contributors. You can get a sense from them as to what the clauses are, what they're about, and take some comfort from seeing their logo on the document. The clauses themselves, as you can see on the screen, are actually picking up on a TCLP initiative. Each explains why you might use it and the climate problem it's supposed to achieve. So they are educative in their own right. Now, the focus of the New Zealand Climate Clause Bank clauses is very much on agreeing broad-based clauses that have the ability to get wide adoption and really are able to be used in as many contracts as possible. So with all that, I will run through what the clauses are. There are 10 of them, and they range from the simple to the more complex. The names of the general topics of each clause are up on the screen now. So we'll quickly run through each of them and give you a flavour for what they involve. The Green Dispute Resolution Clause. So this is my personal favourite because it is such an easy way to introduce people to climate contracting. So no one ever goes into a contract expecting to get into a dispute. So it's really easy to put green obligations into your dispute resolution clause because no one thinks they're ever going to use it. You don't have to explain to your stakeholders that they've got to change a decades-old practice of how we've always done this to agree to this mechanism. It can go in there safe in the knowledge that you probably will never use it, but at least it's been that gateway into climate drafting more generally. So the clause itself fairly simply just requires parties to conduct disputes in a green manner. So reducing printing and travel by using electronic bundles and virtual hearings, and measuring and offsetting emissions associated with the dispute, like from travel for lawyers, witnesses, the experts, etc. Electronic notices is another really simple clause that's a great introduction to climate contracting as well. No one prints notices these days anyway, so this clause effectively just enshrines what people are already doing. It prefers electronic notices to printed form. So again, not a hard clause to get past the internal bureaucracy. Further climate assurances is a clause that encourages people to consider the general climate impacts when performing a contract. So this could be very wide-ranging and does help encourage general sustainability objectives and outcomes within a business. The clause is essentially designed to make sure that people think twice is to see if there is a climate friendlier way to achieve the particular outcome under the contract. So for instance, it might be holding that contract review meeting by Zoom rather than flying to an in-person meeting. It's just designed to make people stop and think for a minute. Electronic execution, another one I'm particularly fond of. It's another simple clause that just requires documents to be signed electronically. With the advances in technology, this is what's happening in the vast majority of contracts anyway. Certainly in my experience, it's lawyers, if anyone, who are resistant to electronic execution. Commercial counterparties actually quite like it because they know that that 100-page contract that they're about to sign, they'll print, they'll get one person to squiggle on page 96, then they'll scan it and shred it anyway, and that does seem like a waste of effort, if nothing else. So again, a really easy one to start including in contracts. Virtual board meetings. So this is a clause for shareholder agreements and constitutions. It just sets a requirement for a certain percentage of board meetings to be held virtually, or in a way that doesn't create emissions. So if all board members are to the same city or building. Again, something that's becoming more common with technological advances and the increasing use of things like Zoom and Teams. The simple carbon neutrality clause is designed for shareholders agreements. It sets a high-level statement of aspiration around operating a business in a carbon neutral way, but it's less prescriptive than other clauses and gives the relevant company discretion as to how to achieve the outcome. So it's a really good clause for smaller companies who want to signal intent, but who just don't have the sort of internal resource to commit to an onerous measurement and reduction clause like the carbon footprint management clause. So this is another clause for shareholders agreements, and it creates the sort of more formal net zero obligations that you might be used to seeing and that are increasingly common overseas. So under this clause, a company has to measure its carbon footprint, it has to reduce it and offset residual emissions, and there are consequences applied to either the company and or shareholders if those obligations aren't met. Termination for green supplier. This is a clause that can go in supply agreements that allows the purchaser to ultimately terminate an agreement without penalty if it can find someone who can perform the same service better on emissions metrics. So importantly, this clause doesn't apply to anything other than emissions. So it is decarbonisation that's prioritised. Essentially, it allows the existing supplier a period to improve its GHG performance as well, so that it can avoid termination by upping its own game. So this clause really does drive changes in supply chains, because regardless of the outcome, whether the new supplier is picked or the existing one gets to keep the contract, emissions will reduce as a consequence. Supply chain carbon footprint monitoring. This is a clause that does what it says. It monitors, requires monitoring and reporting of emissions by a supplier. So this will be particularly useful for the climate reporting entities as that regime starts to come online. And finally, there's an environmental lease, which is a clause for property leases that prioritises environmental performance improvements in the property and actions of the parties. So things like waste minimisation. So if you want to view the New Zealand Climate Clause Bank, you can at our website. The address is there. We're also very proud that this initiative has been shortlisted in the Delivering Social and Economic Benefit category for the World Commerce and Contracting Awards next month. It's really delighted about that. And that is the end of the presentation. So with the remaining time, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. And we have got a few of them, yeah. Just before I get to them, though, I wanted to ask you, or just to be clear, those clauses are available without charge for use, aren't they? You've directed it to the website, but anybody can download them and use them. Good, Great. Thank you so much. So 3 questions here. The first one is about the dispute resolution clause that you've got, and about whether within the context of that clause there's anything about often disputes relate to value, whether there's anything within those clauses that directs how value might be attributed. Traditionally, we've looked at value from an economic sense, but is there anything in the clause that directs the parties to be looking at other things about value that might be environmentally orientated, or about the value of earth or biodiversity, or saving ourselves from climate change? Does that come into resolving the dispute?
It doesn't in that clause. So the clause is very much about the procedure for resolving the disputes, but there are, trying to remember them exactly, but TCLP, some of their clause bank do in particular focus on other outcomes for contracts. So there are clauses that focus on other value rather than just economic value in the contract. So that particular clause is focused on procedure rather than anything else. But there are it is a great idea, and there are definitely clauses out there that look to value beyond what we've traditionally seen.
Right, thanks, Ian. And then another question is about other people getting benefit from these clauses. Who else do you think would benefit from knowing about these clauses? And associated with that, how can we spread the news? Because and you've talked a little bit about procurement arrangements for those who are in-house lawyers, or who are taking their instructions from organisations that have procurement regimes. You could see that the procurement team might be interested in these sorts of clauses. Do you have any other ideas about who beyond the lawyers might be interested, and how we might spread the use of these clauses?
Sure, yeah, look, everyone, I think is the answer. I want everyone to know about them. My kids love these clauses in particular, which I'm very excited about. So look, they are for everyone. Procurement teams, as you've identified, are a key source of use for these clauses. I think what's really important in getting traction on these is to get some organisational buy-in, particularly from that C-suite. If you've got someone who can sponsor these through an organisation, it makes it that much easier. And I think it's important that the awareness of these clauses does spread beyond the legal team and probably beyond the procurement team to the people who do the commercial deals inside an organisation. Ultimately, if you can get people who negotiate the commercials of the deal to stand up for these, then it must be important, because those people only raise the stuff they care about. They don't, like all of us lawyers tend to do, focus on the minutiae and the things that we get worked up about, but no one else does. They focus on what's really important to the deal. And if they're out there saying this is really important to the deal, then it must be, and that will get traction. So as an example, our investment team here at NZGIF is really highly engaged with these clauses, and they will go into fight for them on deals. And that makes it so much easier to get included, because all of a sudden, the people who want the deal done are saying, this is important to me getting this deal done, and that does, and that makes a real difference. So getting people engaged, getting an organisation engaged, getting a sponsor, and getting those commercial people in the organisation to believe in these is my tips.
Cool. And could you give us a bit of feedback on how these clauses have been accepted, or are they being widely used, or is it a hard push to get them used? Have you got a feel for how it's happening, both with your organisation and further afield? Yeah, so look, we're seeing them used fairly broadly. They're going into they've been going into our contracts for the last 2 years, basically. Wow. And it is very rare that we get anyone negotiating these things. It does happen occasionally. We had a deal recently where they were the subject of negotiation. That was a bit of a disappointment to me, if I'm honest. But they generally get accepted, and we do know that other organisations are looking at these clauses. I've been speaking to organisations who want to include them in their procurement processes. We are unquestionably further along the path than anyone else. We've been using these for 2 years, but there are a lot of organisations who are starting to
look at them, figure out how they can include them into their precedents, into the contracts they're drafting. And if their experience is anything like ours, these aren't negotiated because fundamentally they're just they're memorializing what people want to do and are doing anyway. So it's pretty hard to argue against a clause that is designed to help save the world, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully that's right. That's right. And perhaps I suppose this is like the first layer of these clauses, hey, and I suppose as they become more accepted and more widely used, then we can start to think about how we can progress further with similar sorts of climate conscious clauses in the contracts. Are there any thoughts yet about what might come next, or are you kind of focused on bedding these down at the moment first?
Yeah, look, a little from column A, a little from column B, focused on getting the word out about these because these have been picked as kind of gateway clauses. They should be inoffensive. They should have application in most contracts, and that starts to get people thinking about the right sort of outcomes and think about climate contracting more generally. But there is a broader project. TCLP is doing work globally to transpose all of its database of clauses, which is, I think it's 130 odd clauses. They're doing some fantastic work globally to transpose those for local jurisdictions. There's a project here that is doing just that. So there will be more clauses that start to come out over time. They'll be a little bit more niche. I think there are some pretty niche clauses in there for fairly specific transactions, because a lot of the stuff is driven by the particular interests of the people who draft them in the first place. But there is a project to increase the clause bank. So if people are interested in getting involved with that, do reach out, and we can put you in touch with the good people of TCLP to get involved. The more the merrier.
Great. And that actually leads quite nicely into the next question that I have, is that I could expect that there might be people in the audience who can think of climate issues that are peculiar to their area of practice, their area of work. And as a consequence, clauses that they might wish to generate. So they could choose to wait and see what TCLP comes out with, but they might want to be proactive themselves and get clauses underway. And I wonder if you've got any helpful ideas about how they could best do that and the things that perhaps they should take into account in coming up with those sorts of clauses.
Yeah, so look, if you come up with a great clause that you want to use, let me know, because like, I want there to be more clauses. I can definitely put you in touch with ultimately if it can go back into the clause bank, that'd be fantastic. But there's the TCLP folk are always interested in new clauses. So I think if anyone has got some good ideas, go nuts and send them through. Look, really, there's no particular science in this. It's just about thinking about it. If you've got an idea for a clause that will make a difference and you think people can adopt, then there's nothing to stop people putting very bespoke clauses in individual contracts to achieve outcomes. The focus we've had with this initiative is to try and spread the word, so the clauses are a little bit more sort of broad church in their application, but there's no reason why people can't be going off and drafting really specific clauses for very specific outcomes in one-off contracts. But yeah, if you do that, think about whether there's further application of it and do reach out.
Room to share.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Great, thanks. Okay, so that's all I've got. I'm just having a look to see if there are other questions. We've got one, but I think it's a comment. Yeah, it's a comment saying excellent presentation.
Glad you enjoyed it.
So it doesn't look like we've got any more questions, and that's actually good timing. So I wonder if we'll wind up there, and I'll just take a minute to first of all say thank you very much to you, Ian, not only for the for the presentation, both about the clauses, but also that contextual stuff at the beginning. I think that's really useful, thought-provoking information. Just it kind of sits us down, doesn't it, and makes us think about what's going on and why these clauses are so important. But so thank you for your presentation, but thank you too for the work that you're doing in this area, both in relation to the clauses specifically, but also with NZLS, and for being at the forefront and creating this practical tool for lawyers to be climate conscious. I want to say thank you too to Alexandra Finlay, who you've not seen, but she's there in the background behind the scenes setting up the webinar and managing actually the most stressful part of giving a presentation, I think, the IT. So thank you, Alex, we know that you're there. And then a couple of things to just tell you about as we finish up. And the first about Ian, I think you're speaking at the Islands conference, aren't you?
Yes.
Later on this month, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. So for those of you who are in-house lawyers, you will have an opportunity then perhaps to hear him again, and also maybe to meet up with Ian and ask any questions. So that's great. And there's going to be a panel session there too on climate conscious lawyering, which Sophie Mears will be chairing. And Sophie is the Secretary of Lawyers for Climate Action NZ. So that'll be another good one to look out for. A couple of other things to look out for. You'll know perhaps that the Law Society has distributed the climate change policy discussion document, and it's out there for you to have your say on it. So have a read of it, think about what you think of it, and submissions are closing, I think, on the 4th of August on that. So please do be proactive in considering that and having your say. A couple of other things. We've got LCANZI has got an AGM coming up. Yeah, AGM, yay, on Thursday, the 3rd of August. So look out for that. Those of you who are members, you will have received some information about it. You might even get some more, I think, before then. So, yeah, that 3rd of August at 5:30. And we've got, LCANZI has got a couple of other webinars, one other webinar, sorry, that is coming up on the emissions trading scheme. So that's, look out for that. It's going to be next month sometime. Oh, and I just got a message here. The AGM is open to non-members as well. So do come. And I see there's 2 chat things. Oh yeah, no, that was all. So it's open to non-members as well. And I think there's some talk about a little bit of entertainment there as well. And do follow LCANZI, Lawyers for Climate Action NZ, on LinkedIn if you're at all interested, because there you can keep up to date with what's going on. And in fact, even better, if you're not a member, do join. Hey, it's a great organisation. Thank you for coming, folks. Do look out for the opportunities to use these clauses. And I wish you all the best for a great afternoon. Cheers.